Hello, my name is Osha. I like to talk about US history. Today I'm going to be discussing the Grimke family. This is in honor of Women's History Month. Today is March the 28th, 2026. March is recognized as Women's History Month. Now, I chose the Grimke family um, for several reasons. One, the sisters Angelina Grimke and Sarah Moore Grimke were prominent pioneers in the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement and feminist movement in their own rights. And as pioneers, right, and of course, as great activists, formidable activists, they were uh, forerunners of the later feminist movements, right, and they're very significant in in liberation movements in the United States. Uh, but also the Grimke family itself represents the complexity, the conundrum um, of slavery and the racial class, the racial caste system, the racial caste system. So through their family, we can actually have a glimpse at the tragic circumstances of slavery in the South, the slave owning South. In their time, that was in the 19th century, um, they would leave their um, home state of South Carolina, right, and move permanently to the New England area. They had moved to Philadelphia at some point to become Quakers, and then they moved to New York and Massachusetts, and so they lived in New England in the north, and they became prominent activists. They were groundbreaking in that um, in the 19th century it's very difficult. It's very different and unrecognizable to us today in the 21st century. But women were restricted to certain roles, and public speakers was not, one of the roles that they could do. So they were the first female public speakers speaking against slavery. They were abolitionists. They got all sorts of threats and but they were very fortunate that America, we all are fortunate that they were relentless and fearless, and they had support, and they were very formidable as public speakers. So back then, um, you know they were amongst the first. In fact, they were the first two people in the American Anti-Slavery Society to register as agents. They were trained as agents to go and make presentations against slavery, right? Presenting the horrors of slavery. It was through this anti-slavery society trainings that Angelina Grimke would meet her future husband. That's Theodore Dwight Weld, who himself became um, a brilliant author and prominent abolitionist. Now, I'm going to, I guess, because it's the Grimke family. They apart from showing us the tragic uh, the tragic tapestry of slavery in the South, which was one of the reasons why they were very significant and instrumental in the North, because most of the people living in the North and New England, they were divorced from the horrors of what was going on in the slave owning South. But these two women were actually born into very wealthy aristocratic, if you could call, we didn't have an aristocratic class in America because we prohibited that in our constitution. But the slave owning South had what was called a planter class, and they were the upper class. So the planter class were extremely wealthy, they were slave owning, and they owned large plantations. So Sarah Grimke and her sister Angelina was the younger one, uh, both were born to a very wealthy, um, uh, as patrician as they come, very wealthy planter family. In fact, many Americans, who aspire to some kind of aristocratic pretensions from Europe, well, the Grimke family was the real deal, right? The Grimke family was the real deal. They actually, through their mother, were descendants of British aristocracy, right? Their mother's ancestor was a governor of South Carolina. His name was um, uh, Thomas Smith, and he'd been a baron, right? He'd been an English baron. He was governor of South Carolina. So they came from a very distinguished upper class family, very wealthy, on their mother's side and on their father's side. Their father's side was, their father was a guy, was John uh, Fauchereau Grimke. That was their father. Their father was descended from very interesting from French and Germans. Right, in the early 13 colonies uh, during independence and post independence. We've been introduced to founding fathers who were mainly British descent. Right, from John Adams, the George Washington, the Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. These were Englishmen. They had previously been Englishmen, but the Grimke family were different. So their ancestors, as their father John Fauchereau Grimke, his maternal grandparents were actually French Huguenots who fled France, persecution in France in the 17th century during the reign of Louis XIV, who was Emperor of France. He was a Catholic, and what he did was he stripped the Protestants, French Protestants, who followed the Calvinist faith, and these were Huguenots. He stripped them of all their rights, and so they had to flee. They fled to different parts that were more tolerant. Right, many fled to New England. Uh, the uh, uh, the maternal grandparents of John Fauchereau Grimke uh, moved to South Carolina. And on his father's side, his paternal grandparents were Germans. They came from Germany. So, in any event, their father, that's the Grimke sisters' father, was a very prominent and accomplished man. He studied at Princeton University, the Ivy League, the elites. He studied at Princeton University, and he was a very accomplished man. He was a Revolutionary War veteran, right? He fought in the War of Revolution. He graduated from Princeton University. He also went, after that, he also went to England, went to study in England at Cambridge University. He went to, and then he became qualified as a barrister through the Middle Temple of the Inns of Court. So that's the system in England. He qualified as a lawyer, and he returned, and he became very accomplished. He became a judge. He became, of course, he participated in the War of Independence, and then he became a judge. He uh, became mayor. He was mayor of Charleston, South Carolina at some point. He was member of the South Carolina House of Representatives. He became Speaker of the South Carolina House of Representatives, and he was a member of the State Constitutional Convention, which reviewed and ratified the U.S. Constitution in 1788. He reviewed it. Of course, it was adopted. The U.S. Constitution was adopted in 1789. I've done an earlier video in which I discussed the uh, Alexander Hamilton and John uh, sorry, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison had written the Federalist Papers to try and convince delegates in the states to adopt and ratify the U.S. Constitution of 1789. And so, interestingly, you see the people there, because so the Federalist Papers were arguments, they were arguments and reasons why the states should adopt the U.S. Constitution. So you can see people like Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay. They were writing for brilliant people like um, John Fauchereau, Grimke, who was excellently trained, right? He was a graduate of Princeton University at Cambridge. He was a lawyer, and so he was excellently trained. He was a brilliant legal mind, and so the Federalist Papers was very important. And you can see the brilliance of our founding fathers like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. They were convincing people equally as brilliant and educated as they were. So very accomplished family, but they were large. They were a slave owning family, right? They had these huge plantations. They owned slaves. Their fortune was built on slavery. But these sisters, Angelina, Grimke, and um, her older sister. Her older sister was about 13 years older than her. That's Sarah Moore Grimke. Sarah Moore Grimke was born in 1792, and Angelina was born in roughly 1805. And so uh, uh, Sarah was sort of a maternal figure to Angelina. It's interesting. They lived together almost throughout their lives, right? They lived together almost throughout their lives because they both permanently left South Carolina because they hated the institution of slavery so much. Uh, of course, they had these restricted rules. Sarah was very intelligent. Her father, back then, women were not allowed to go to school. They weren't trained to go to school in the early 18th century. So her father was a lawyer. So back then, most wealthy people had huge libraries. Remember, someone like Thomas Jefferson had the largest library in North America, and he donated his library he didn't donate it, where the US government bought his library after the War of 1812 destroyed the Library of Congress. And so he donated his library to the Library of, sorry, he sold his library to the Library of Congress. The United States government bought it from him. And we had 6,500 volumes. And so the Grimke's, that's John Fauchereau, Grimke had a very large library as well. And he allowed Sarah to study his law books. Now, back then, the upper class, the patrician class of the slave owning South, the planter class, what they did was they the education they provided the sons with an education to be able to have a profession, but the upper class, the women, uh, were not, they were not allowed to work outside the home. It was frowned upon, right? There's certain things. It's not like they made a law and said, well, wealthy women can't work outside the home. But there are just certain things that are customary, right? They're just unspoken customs, right? So it was one of those things. And what they did was the wealthy, they gave the sort of education that they gave their women, their daughters, was to enable them to be conversant, good conversationalists in society, to become society women, and to be good wives, right? So they trained them in French. That was the language, the chic language, the posh language at the time in the South. They trained them in how to speak French. They would train them in painting, in conversation, in in the harpsichord. That was the sort of training that the Grimke sisters had. However, uh, uh, Sarah Grimke was fortunate that her father let her study in his libraries, right? In his law library. So she read his law books, right? So, and he used to say that, well, she would have been the most brilliant lawyer in America, in the country, had she been born a man. So she couldn't become a lawyer because she was a female at the time. Uh, Notably, the first woman to become a lawyer, to qualify as a lawyer in America, was a woman called Arabelle Mansfield, when she passed the Iowa State Bar in 1869. So interestingly, she never practiced, but she qualified when she had extremely high scores on the Iowa bar exam. Now, back then, there are all these stereotypes and presumptions, stereotypes, and attitudes about women's abilities and intelligence. So they've just been prohibited, but from participating in certain professions because, again, women were viewed from a very traditional, narrow, bigoted perspective, that they were created to serve men, to be subordinate to men, or to satisfy men. So it's funny. These were notions that they ostensibly acquired from the Bible, that that Eve was created to be to as a gift to Adam. So in kind of interesting that it was from their fervent, passionate study of the Bible, because both Angelina and Sarah Grimke were very religious, and they took their Bible studies very seriously since they couldn't study anything else. So they were passionate students of the Bible, and it was from their studies of the Bible that they concluded that, well, that true Christianity preached the equality of both men and women, that they were equal, and that Christianity abhorred or frowned on slavery, the institution of slavery. So they became very passionate abolitionists. Once they moved out of South Carolina, they left their family. In fact, they would never see their mother again once they left as young women and moved up north to Philadelphia and then to New England. They would never see their mother again after following the death of their father. Their father died, maybe when it was 59 or so, and Sarah had been selected to be his caregiver because he moved to Philadelphia, when he was very ill, and she attended to him, she nursed him, and so once he died, she never moved back, and she just called for her sister, Angelina, and they both moved up north. So, as I was saying, the first woman to qualify as a lawyer in America was um, Arabelle Smith, and Arabelle Smith would um, she didn't practice, though she wouldn't practice as an attorney, but she would use her skills, her training, to support the suffragist movement, right? The movement to give women the vote, right? And support Susan B. Anthony. That was another prominent abolitionist and suffragette. So in any event, the Grimke family, again, they came from a very wealthy, patrician, aristocratic family from Europe. They were very highly established, very wealthy planter class in South Carolina. Uh, they would produce an African American line. So I'm going to do a video and I'm going to discuss the African American line of the Grimke family. So of course in South Carolina, um, uh, miscegenation was the law, right? Anti-miscegenation was the law, right? Blacks and whites could not marry in order to preserve slavery, and the institution of pater sequitur ventrum, which meant that uh, a child that was born followed held the permanent status of its mother, right? So, and also later on, laws that were instituted that prevented slave owners from being able to free free their slaves. So South Carolina in 1820 passed a law that banned manumission. Manumission is where a slave owner privately sets his slave free. So South Carolina established a law that only a slave can only be freed by an act of the state legislature, right? So all slaves were perpetually, at least if they're in South Carolina, they were perpetually slaves and they could not be freed at any time. So South Carolina was one of the most brutal places where slavery was practiced. Remember, I've talked about the Mudsill theory, the founder of the Mudsill theory, which said that it posited that there's a class of people, laborers, that they perpetually to serve an upper class, right? And they're not supposed to leave that class, right? So like slaves in the case of the era of slavery, the slaves they were meant to perpetually serve an upper class and elite. The founder of that Mudsill theory was a guy called James Hammond. He was a senator. James Hammond, I've done a video discussing him previously, and so he pioneered that theory of the Mudsill theory. And of course, he actually popularized the term cotton is king. And so South Carolina uh, practiced about the most brutal form of slavery in America or anywhere else in the world. American slavery, of course, was the most brutal, was very brutal, right? And so it had this very strict, structured caste system. However, um, it was common for slave masters to get into relationships uh, with their black slaves, right? So uh, one of John uh, Fauchereau Grimke's sons, Henry W. Grimke, he was a graduate of Yale. He would get into a domestic relationship, partner relationship with one of his personal slaves. Her name was Nancy Weston. After his wife died, right, he would move away to a plantation about 25 miles from Charleston, so that he could continue and live in a live officially. Well, it couldn't be official, but he wanted to live, not he wanted to live in a sort of domestic partner relationship with his slave, his African slave by the name of Nancy Weston, and the children she gave birth to him. There were three of them. He treated them as if he recognized them as children. He trained them, but of course, under the law, uh, he could not free them. So when he died, he could not free them, and South Carolina had created a law in 1841 prohibiting freedom of slaves through trusts, right? Because that was another way that many uh, slave owners tried to free their slaves using trusts. And so South Carolina absolutely prohibited the ability of slave owners to free slaves. So his children, through his slave woman, who was actually he recognized her as his common law. He lived with her like his common law wife. They could not be recognized under the law. So uh, Archibald Grimke and Francis Grimke, they went on to be very prominent African Americans, even though they started off as slaves. In fact, Archibald Grimke, it's interesting, through the support of the Grimke sisters, after they found them out, they would support them, and Archibald Grimke became the second African American to graduate from Harvard Law School. So it's ironic that though Sarah Grimke herself, she was a woman, she could never qualify and become a lawyer. She would support her half and formerly enslaved nephew, Archibald Grimke, an African American. She would support him to be able to graduate, to go to school at Harvard Law School. and he graduated and he became a lawyer. He became very successful. I'm going to stop this video here, and I'm going to continue with my discussion on the Grimke family. My name is Osha, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.